In 2015, in the city of Boise, Idaho, Judge Marcus Delaney held a reputation built on decades of disciplined work, firm rulings, and a quiet charisma that commanded respect both inside and outside the courtroom. As an African-American man in a predominantly white judicial circuit, his success was not only professional but symbolic. He had risen from modest beginnings, graduating at the top of his class from Howard University's law school, and steadily worked his way up through public defense, prosecution, and eventually the bench. By 42, he had become a fixture of the county courthouse and a name spoken with reverence by colleagues and adversaries alike. His wife, Taryn Delaney, was 32, with soft features and a gentle voice. She taught music at a small private Christian academy and was known among her peers as devoted and kind-hearted. She and Marcus had been married for 6 years, and after years of waiting, she was now pregnant with their first child. It was a child prayed for, longed for, and, at least outwardly, joyously anticipated. The neighbors often commented on how perfect the Delaneys seemed. They lived in a neat 2-story colonial house on the outskirts of Boise, hosted holiday charity drives, and attended church regularly. Their Christmas cards featured matching sweaters and scripted messages of gratitude. But beneath the polished surface, a quiet fracture had begun to spread. In the privacy of their home, silence had taken root. Marcus had become increasingly distant over the past year, retreating into long hours at the courthouse and late nights spent alone in his home office. Taryn noticed how he flinched slightly when she reached for his hand or rested her head on his shoulder. He no longer asked about her doctor appointments, avoided conversations about baby names, and rarely touched the nursery they had started to prepare together. She could not recall the last time they had shared a meal without him checking his phone between bites or excusing himself early. Taryn tried to rationalize it. Stress, she thought. The courts had been overwhelmed that season with backlogged cases and a rising wave of juvenile crimes that Marcus had taken personally. But deep down, she felt something more fragile had cracked. She wandered the halls of their home in the evenings, pausing at the doorway of the nursery, unsure whether to continue decorating or leave it unfinished. She had once kept a journal of her pregnancy, recording moments of joy and fear. Now, its pages remained blank. The only presence that seemed to bring any vitality into the house was Marcus's twin brother, Malcolm Delaney. Identical in appearance but strikingly different in spirit, Malcolm was looser, louder, and unapologetically unpolished. He had no steady job, floated between gigs as a freelance mechanic and occasional delivery driver, and carried a casual disregard for structure that grated against his brother's rigid worldview. Where Marcus spoke in composed, measured tones, Malcolm gestured wildly and laughed with abandon. He had struggled with alcohol in the past and had left a string of unstable relationships behind him. Despite their differences, Malcolm was often present in their lives, sometimes dropping by unannounced in the afternoons or showing up with takeout in the evenings when Marcus worked late. He would bring laughter and warmth into the living room, filling the silence with stories, jokes, and questions about the baby. Taryn found herself smiling more when he was around. She did not think much of it at first. Malcolm was family. He was someone who saw her, someone who noticed when she was tired, someone who complimented her without looking distracted. She tried to ignore the small flutter of energy she felt when he walked in. It was probably just hormones, she told herself. But over time, those visits grew more frequent. Malcolm lingered longer. Sometimes he arrived before Marcus had even left for work, offering coffee and casual banter. The boundaries of propriety blurred so subtly that they felt unnoticeable. A glance too long, a pause too loaded, a silence too comfortable. The fracture that had split the marriage widened, quietly, invisibly, until it reached a point from which there would be no return. Desperation, once subtle and internal, began to take form inside Taryn like a growing shadow. Her longing for connection, the aching emptiness beside her in bed each night, and the steady erosion of her husband's warmth had carved out a hollow space that begged to be filled. The silence in the house became oppressive. Every glance Marcus avoided, every word left unsaid, every night he chose the study over their shared bedroom fed her creeping sense of abandonment. It wasn't just loneliness, it was the fear of disappearing while still alive. Malcolm became the lifeline she had not sought but quietly accepted. He arrived with humor and attention, noticing her new maternity dress, asking about her sleep, praising the gentle lullabies she still hummed as habit. He was everything Marcus had ceased to be: present, responsive, and emotionally available. She didn't set out to betray her husband. At first, their interactions felt harmless: a shared joke, a comforting hand on her shoulder, a prolonged goodbye. But the emotional gap between her and Marcus had grown so vast that the small warmth Malcolm offered felt like rescue. With each visit, the boundaries slipped further. Malcolm's presence became regular, expected. He would arrive when Marcus was scheduled in court and linger through dusk. Sometimes he brought groceries. Sometimes he cooked. Sometimes he stayed until the evening light dimmed the windows. One rainy afternoon, when the air in the house felt heavier than ever, their closeness crossed the threshold. That moment wasn't explosive or dramatic. It was quiet, resigned, even soft. And once it happened, neither of them spoke of stopping. Their physical relationship intensified, pulled forward by secrecy and adrenaline. Taryn found herself waiting for the sound of Malcolm's knock, dressing with more care, glancing at the clock and hoping her husband wouldn't cancel his late hearings. She began to experience flickers of joy again, guilt-laced but undeniable. She rationalized it by clinging to what she had lost: connection, validation, affection. Marcus had already let her go. In her mind, she hadn't broken anything. She had simply followed the fracture. By the end of November, Taryn stood in her bathroom staring at 2 pink lines on a pregnancy test. The result was expected, yet terrifying. She counted dates in her head, replayed moments, narrowed down possibilities, but with Malcolm's visits overlapping her cycle, the truth remained unclear. She told herself it didn't matter. The child would be raised in a stable home. Marcus would believe it was his. But underneath that fragile logic, the question of paternity lodged in her chest like a shard. One evening, as the days grew shorter and the nights came early, Malcolm arrived again. He believed Marcus was in court for a late sentencing. Taryn let him in without hesitation. The routine had become familiar. Upstairs, the bedroom light glowed warm against the cold outside. They moved together like 2 people clinging to a shared illusion. It felt normal, until it didn't. Marcus had returned home earlier than expected. Suspicion had been gnawing at him for weeks. Taryn's avoidance of eye contact, the faint smell of unfamiliar cologne on a pillow, and the careful silence in his home had awakened his instincts. That evening, he parked his car 2 houses down and waited, engine off, breath tight. He watched Malcolm enter through the side gate and waited until the shadows inside shifted. He sat in the darkness of the car for nearly an hour. Then he stepped out, entered the house quietly, and moved through the lower floor with the practiced calm of a man used to evidence and silence. From the foot of the stairs, he heard them moving. He didn't speak. He walked to the kitchen, opened the drawer where he kept the good knives, and chose one without hesitation. What followed upstairs took less than a minute. He opened the bedroom door to find them tangled in sheets, the illusion still warm and breathing. Taryn saw him first, her eyes widening in disbelief, and then Malcolm turned. Marcus didn't shout. He didn't flinch. He stepped forward and drove the knife into his brother's chest with deliberate force. The sound was dull, wet. Malcolm gasped once, eyes frozen in betrayal. He collapsed onto the bed, blood already soaking through the sheets. Taryn screamed, a sound filled with confusion and horror. She reached for Malcolm, tried to stop the bleeding, pressed trembling hands to his chest. But he was gone before she could speak his name. Marcus stood over them, unmoving, the knife still in his hand, his breath calm and even. The betrayal had a shape now. It had a face. And he had carved his justice into it. Marcus moved with precision. The shock of what he had done seemed to bypass the usual flood of panic and instead gave way to something colder, something methodical. His hands, still stained, did not tremble. He stared at his brother's lifeless body for a moment, then at his wife, who was paralyzed beside it, her mouth open in a silent scream. Without a word, he stepped away from the scene and walked calmly down the stairs. In the kitchen, he turned on the faucet and washed the blood from his fingers. Then he took a fresh towel, dried his hands carefully, and removed his shirt. He changed into a clean one, then retrieved the stained shirt and returned upstairs. He pressed it against his brother's chest to absorb more blood, then wiped down the knife with its sleeve. Moving with calm efficiency, he placed the knife into Taryn's limp hand, wrapping her fingers tightly around the handle. He made sure her fingerprints would be the last on the weapon. He took a final look at the room, noting the overturned lamp, the shattered picture frame, the disheveled bed, details that told a story. A story he would now control. Marcus picked up his phone and dialed 911. His voice, when he spoke, was filled with the right balance of urgency and distress. He told the dispatcher that he had returned home unexpectedly to find his wife in a frenzy, standing over his twin brother's body, knife in hand. He claimed she had screamed at Malcolm to leave her alone, that she had warned him she would kill him if he didn't stop. He described the scene as one of emotional collapse, an outburst born of fear and rage. The authorities arrived within 15 minutes. The flashing lights lit up the quiet Boise street, painting the windows in pulses of red and blue. Taryn was still upstairs, sitting beside Malcolm's body in a daze. Her hands, still gripping the handle of the knife, were streaked with blood. Her nightgown was soaked at the sleeves. When the officers entered the room, she looked up at them with wide, unblinking eyes, unable to form words. She shook her head repeatedly, but the motion looked more like a tremor than denial. The initial survey of the scene supported Marcus's version of events. The room bore all the signs of a chaotic struggle: scattered items, blood on the bedding and floor, the body positioned with a single visible stab wound to the chest. Forensics found Taryn's fingerprints on the handle of the knife and her DNA under Malcolm's nails, likely transferred during her desperate attempt to stop the bleeding. The timeline of Marcus's call to emergency services aligned with the estimated time of death. His calm demeanor, though unusual, was interpreted as restraint. He was, after all, a judge, trained to remain composed in crisis. He gave his statement with the detached clarity of a man reliving a nightmare he did not expect. He claimed to love both his wife and his brother, to have walked into an unthinkable moment. He said he hadn't wanted to believe what he saw, but the evidence was there. His testimony was flawless. He emphasized that Taryn had not been herself for weeks, that she had seemed paranoid and withdrawn, that she had accused Malcolm of inappropriate behavior. It all added a layer of psychological instability to the image of a woman pushed too far. Detectives photographed the scene, collected evidence, and took Marcus's blood-stained shirt into custody as part of the record. They escorted Taryn away in handcuffs, though gently. She didn't resist. Her words were incoherent. She kept trying to speak, but nothing made sense. The officers interpreted it as shock, possibly guilt. One of them even placed a hand on her back as she was led to the patrol car. Marcus stood on the front lawn as his wife was driven away. He answered more questions from the investigators, nodding when needed, expressing sadness at what had unfolded. He explained that the pregnancy had made things tense, that his wife's moods had become unpredictable, that she had felt alone. He never once raised his voice. He never let the mask slip. By the end of the night, Taryn was booked for second-degree murder. Marcus returned to a house that now felt like a perfectly staged crime scene. He walked into the bedroom one last time before sealing it off. He looked at the blood, at the mess, and then turned off the light. He knew how investigations worked. He knew how juries thought. And he knew, above all, that justice could be manipulated just as easily as truth, if told with the right tone. The trial was held at the Ada County Courthouse in downtown Boise, the same building where Marcus Delaney had spent years delivering verdicts from the bench. But this time, he sat among the public, behind the bar, facing the weight of a case that drew quiet whispers through courthouse corridors. Due to his position and prior affiliation with nearly every judge in the circuit, a magistrate from neighboring Twin Falls County was brought in to preside, ensuring impartiality. The courtroom was tightly managed. Reporters were limited. No cameras were allowed. The gravity of the proceedings demanded order. The prosecution's case centered on the theory of a love affair gone wrong. According to the narrative, Taryn Delaney, emotionally unstable and overwhelmed by her pregnancy, had developed an illicit relationship with her husband's twin brother. When Malcolm attempted to end the affair, Taryn responded with deadly violence. They portrayed her as a woman cornered by her own secrets, motivated by fear of abandonment and shame. They relied on physical evidence, the blood spatter on her clothing, her fingerprints on the knife, the bruising consistent with a struggle. The single fatal wound to Malcolm's chest, clean and deliberate, was described by the forensic pathologist as deep enough to require committed force. The defense, on the other hand, framed the entire case as a calculated deception. They pointed out the inconsistencies in the timeline, the lack of motive from Taryn, and her physical limitations, 7 months pregnant and of slight build. The defense attorney emphasized that the fatal wound required precision and strength unlikely to have come from a panicked, overwhelmed woman in her condition. Moreover, they suggested that the crime scene had been altered, though they lacked conclusive evidence to prove it. The prosecution's advantage lay in its simplicity, the defense's weakness lay in its complexity. Marcus took the stand on the third day. He spoke with the authority of experience and the demeanor of a wounded husband. He described finding Taryn in a state of rage, kneeling beside his brother, covered in blood. He claimed she confessed to him in a haze, that she admitted Malcolm had betrayed her and that she had snapped. His words were measured, his tone restrained. To the jury, he looked like a man burdened by duty, not vengeance. He did not break down. He did not accuse. He painted the picture of a man devastated by both loss and loyalty. The jury deliberated for nearly 2 full days. Behind closed doors, they struggled with the question of intent. There were no eyewitnesses. No surveillance footage. No confession. Only a single moment of death surrounded by contradicting stories. In the end, they returned a verdict of guilty, not of murder in the first degree, but of involuntary manslaughter under aggravated circumstances. It was a compromise that satisfied neither side entirely, but aligned with the limited evidence. The sentencing hearing came 6 weeks later. The courtroom was somber. Taryn sat quietly, her hands folded over her rounded stomach. She was visibly exhausted, her skin pale, her posture subdued. The judge addressed the court in firm but composed language, noting the tragedy of the circumstances and the uncertainty that still lingered around the case. He sentenced her to 15 years in a state correctional facility, with eligibility for parole after 10, contingent on conduct and psychological evaluation. The child, the judge noted, would be born in the prison infirmary. The court recommended that custody be reviewed post-delivery to determine placement with a family member. Marcus remained stoic throughout the ruling. He did not look at his wife. Taryn, meanwhile, seemed detached from the outcome, as if still lost in the unreality of what had happened. As she was led from the courtroom, her steps slow and hesitant, there were no outbursts. No tears. Only silence. News of the trial spread modestly through local outlets. Headlines called it a domestic tragedy. No mention was made of Marcus's position, out of respect or restraint. The verdict, though seemingly fair, left a residue of discomfort. There were those who felt the full truth had never surfaced. Others accepted the ruling as the closest thing to justice. But behind the courthouse doors, something had quietly fractured, not just a family, but a system that had allowed one man to write the ending of another. 2 years after the conviction, the case of Taryn Delaney had all but disappeared from public memory. The press had moved on, the court dockets were filled with newer tragedies, and the prison system absorbed another quiet inmate into its routines. But for Lauren Hale, a young intern in the district attorney's office, something about the trial had never sat right. She had been assigned to digitize old case files for archival purposes when she came across the Delaney folder. What began as routine data entry slowly turned into a growing sense of unease. Lauren had studied law to understand not just how justice was administered but how it was shaped. The case struck her as too clean. The narrative, too perfect. Marcus Delaney's testimony had been flawless, but almost rehearsed, stripped of any true emotional complexity. It bothered her how precise he had been in recounting a scene that should have shattered him. There had been no visible signs of grief. No public vulnerability. Just composure. Clinical and contained. She began to review supplemental evidence logs. One entry mentioned surveillance footage from a neighboring house, dismissed at the time due to poor lighting and low visibility. Curious, she requested the raw files from city archives and enhanced them using updated software. What she found was subtle but significant. In one recording, timestamped the evening of the murder, Malcolm Delaney could be seen entering the side gate of Marcus and Taryn's home. The footage was grainy, shadowed by tree limbs, but the frame captured his distinct gait and silhouette. Roughly 30 minutes later, another figure approached the house. Same build, same height, but with a stiffer walk, a posture more familiar from courthouse footage. It was Marcus. This contradicted the official timeline presented at trial. Marcus had claimed to arrive home unexpectedly, catching the two in the act. But the footage suggested he had arrived long after Malcolm. The difference wasn't just technical, it reshaped the motive, the opportunity, the sequence of events. Lauren flagged the inconsistency and compiled a preliminary report. Her instincts pushed her further. She began to review Marcus's post-trial activity. In the 2 years following Taryn's sentencing, he had experienced an uncharacteristic surge in professional momentum. He was nominated for a state ethics panel, accepted onto a judicial review board, and appeared in multiple public forums discussing restorative justice and court reform. He declined interviews about his personal life but took every opportunity to project stability and vision. Internally, however, he had requested the rapid reassignment of all family-related cases and made formal efforts to seal juvenile records tied to his late brother. The pattern of containment was becoming clear. Lauren submitted her findings to the State Bureau of Internal Affairs. They authorized a discreet inquiry under the pretense of judicial conduct review. A warrant was obtained for a covert forensic audit of Marcus's devices, executed while he was away at a legal symposium in Seattle. The contents of his personal laptop, though mostly wiped, revealed fragments of previously deleted files recovered from deep storage. Among them were drafts of letters addressed to Taryn, unsent messages layered with cryptic regret. Phrases like "I never meant for it to go this far" and "I thought I could erase it" repeated across documents with no recipient fields. There were also portions of speeches, apparently prepared for lectures he never gave. These texts wandered into abstract reflections on guilt, consequence, and constructed morality. One file, titled Control, read more like a confession masked in metaphor than a scholarly draft. He described justice as a pane of glass, clear until it cracks. And once it cracks, he wrote, it never reflects the truth the same way again. The internal team also uncovered a private folder encrypted under an innocuous name. After decoding, it revealed a collection of scanned journal entries, dated within days of the murder. Some were no more than a few sentences. One described the sound of the knife sliding into flesh. Another described standing over Malcolm and feeling nothing but silence. Not grief. Not rage. Silence. The final piece came from metadata extracted from one of the drafts. It placed Marcus's device inside his house at a time that aligned with the moment of Malcolm's death, before the emergency call, and earlier than his official arrival according to his own testimony. The timeline was now irreparably fractured. He had written. He had deleted. But he had not erased everything. What remained was enough to force a reopening of the case. Enough to shift suspicion, to expose the cracks that had gone unnoticed under the gloss of authority. Lauren had not set out to dismantle a judge. But the more she looked, the clearer it became. Marcus had crafted a lie so perfect that only the faintest imperfections, buried in pixels and half-forgotten files, could undo it. In 2021, 6 years after Taryn Delaney had been convicted and imprisoned, the truth finally surfaced in a courtroom stripped of illusion. Marcus Delaney, once revered as the embodiment of legal integrity, was arrested and charged with obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence, and perjury. The investigation had revealed a layered and calculated manipulation of both the crime scene and the legal system. Though prosecutors could not pursue a murder charge due to the absence of direct evidence of intent and lack of forensic proof beyond reasonable doubt, the deception itself was undeniable. The trial was swift, clinical, and lacking the grandeur of his former courtroom days. Marcus did not fight the charges. He waived his right to a lengthy defense, offered no explanation, and declined to speak during sentencing. Throughout the proceedings, he kept his eyes fixed on the table before him. The man who had once wielded the law with composed authority now sat as its subject, diminished and silent. The judge who presided over his case, flown in from Oregon to avoid any appearance of local bias, called the betrayal a breach not only of trust, but of the entire fabric of justice. Marcus was sentenced to 8 years in a state correctional facility. It was a reduced sentence, reflecting his cooperation with investigators and the absence of prior criminal history. But the real punishment was in the symbolic collapse. Newspapers across the region printed his booking photo beside archival images of him in black robes, smiling before marble columns. Journalists likened the story to a modern Greek tragedy, an architect of justice undone by his own design. Taryn was quietly released from prison 2 months before Marcus's sentencing. Her exoneration came not with fanfare but with a brief judicial order vacating her conviction and expunging her record. She left the correctional facility with little more than a canvas bag and a coat that no longer fit. The world she re-entered had shifted without her. The house was gone. Her name had been sullied, then cleared. But the years could not be returned. She did not stay in Idaho. Within weeks of her release, she legally changed her name and moved east, declining all media inquiries and interviews. The few people who had known her spoke only in vague terms, citing trauma, fatigue, and the need for privacy. Her daughter, Alice, had been raised by Taryn's older sister in Minnesota, a spirited girl with sharp features and a thoughtful gaze. Taryn visited when she could, always keeping her distance from the public eye. Mother and daughter maintained a quiet, carefully rebuilt bond, free from explanation or apology. Alice grew into a thoughtful and determined young woman. As she entered adulthood, her curiosity about the past deepened. She knew the outlines of the story, what had happened to her parents, how her life had been shaped by someone else's choices. But the details remained locked away in court documents and silent conversations. She carried her mother's surname and rarely mentioned the name Delaney. It belonged to a man she had never truly known, and who had stolen something from them both. When Alice was accepted into a top-tier law school, she chose to focus on criminal justice. In her final year, she applied for an internship through a public interest program. Without ceremony or dramatic intention, she submitted her application to the very courthouse in Boise where her father had once served. The building still bore his influence, the library shelves, the hallway portraits, the courtroom procedures he had helped standardize. But Alice entered not with vengeance, nor nostalgia, but with resolve. She believed that justice was not a performance, not a role one put on like a robe. It was a path walked imperfectly, shaped by intention, and often forged in pain. Her story had begun with silence and betrayal. But it did not end there. In the same halls that once echoed with her father's verdicts, she walked as a student of the law, not to undo what had been, but to ensure that truth would never again be bent in the name of control.